Buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to this third day of the doctoral seminar program Charles the Fifth European Award, Angela Merkel. The topic is the fortune of being united, securing and strengthening Europe's cohesion. Now we have with us Wilbemis Jerez Ribero from the University of Alcalá. He's originally from Cuba, so he can give us an external vision. He will tell us about justice as a social, the justice as a tool of for social cohesion in Europe, challenges and solutions for the inclusion of vulnerable groups within the framework of European policy values. He's going to be introduced by BETTINA STEIBLE, professor of public law at the Open University of Catalonia. Thanks so much, Bettina, for chairing two of these sessions and devoting yourself fully to the seminar. Bettina, the floor is yours. Good morning. I want to reinstate my thanks to the foundation. Once again, I want to say that it is a pleasure to be here. As Miguel was saying, we are going to listen to Wilbemis Jerez Rivero from the University of Alcalá. He's going to talk to us about a very interesting topic, the access to justice as a tool for social cohesion in Europe. In his presentation, he is going to talk about vulnerable groups as an example, as an access for his analysis. I don't want to steal any of Wilbemis's time. So, without any further ado, I will give him the floor. Wilbemis, the floor is yours. Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the foundation, of course. Thanks so much for uh, giving me the immense privilege of sharing this day with you. Some of the reflections uh, that are included in my work that I have been developing for a very short period of time have a very significant weight for me. I want to thank all organizers, and when I talk about the organizers, I want to refer to everyone who made this event possible. And this event has a wonderful quality. I want to refer to Miguel Angel, interpreters, people who are in charge of production, everyone. I also want to thank the members of the jury for taking the time to assess our work. And in this seminar, they are making a great effort to share their reflections to improve our work. And lastly, but equally important, I also want to thank the excellent colleagues that I am sharing my time with and that we are sharing debates and thought with. I really hope that we can keep in touch beyond Yuste, and maybe we can see each other again if we get invited again to the upcoming editions. This said, I want to say that we are living decisive times. So this is a decisive moment for the European project. Social tensions, democratic challenges. I think I lost my presentation. Well, now you have my presentation. This is a spoiler. How can I go to the first slide? Apologies for this technical glitch. As I was saying, we are living at times of tension. This very complicated time for the European project, as social tensions, democratic challenges, and institution disaffection are counterbalanced by a renewed commitment to social justice, inclusion, and why not the defense of the Union's founding values. In this context, my speech is based on a very clear but profound conviction. Without effective access to justice, we can't talk about real democracy or social cohesion. These are not possible. So, this is why I intend to share with you this idea at this specific crossroads. Access to justice as a tool for social cohesion in Europe, challenges and solutions for the inclusion of vulnerable groups within the framework of European policies and values. So, I have structured to this end this presentation around six fundamental moments. We will start by talking about the elemental theoretical aspects, why I chose the topic, the methodology, what we try to address with the research. Then we will talk about access to justice. And we have to wonder what this means, whether it is regulated in any instrument, the specificities of this right to access to justice, access to justice, and thirdly, we will present the vulnerable groups and we will elaborate on the specific barriers faced by certain vulnerable groups. Then we will talk about social cohesion and we will connect this first with what social cohesion involves in terms of access and justice and how this connects to people in situations of vulnerability. The fifth aspect is to talk about those examples and good practices that social cohesion mm, made possible and how these vulnerable groups can access justice. And then, lastly, I will share my considerations on this topic. There is still a lot to do when it comes to fostering social cohesion in connection to the right to justice to people and groups in vulnerable conditions. I don't want to take too much time, but I think we must reference to why I chose this topic. I want to mention very clearly that when I was doing some research on this topic, there is an idea that drew my attention. The idea of the right to justice is a human right, but there are certain groups or people who face limitations when it comes to accessing this right. So I had this idea of connecting social cohesion, that is, social and territorial policies in the European Union, to promote the access to justice for these groups and people in vulnerable conditions. Projects always require a methodological structure that is fundamental for all research. So, the purpose of our research is to analyze how the effective access to justice acts as a structural social cohesion mechanism in the um, in the EU, focusing on the situation of people in vulnerable conditions. Here we have several objectives, but for this presentation today, I will just mention three. First, um, a critical analysis on the regulatory framework in the field of the access to justice. Secondly, we want to reference the assessment of how social cohesion policies impact in a cross-cutting way the inclusion of groups and people in a vulnerable condition nationally and internationally, and more specifically locally. And then on a third level, we're going to propose practical elements after having identified the obstacles that vulnerable people face. We can find instruments to try to overcome these barriers. Now, in terms of the methodology, I must mention that this work takes a multidisciplinary approach. We're not just going to focus on legal aspects. We are also going to elaborate and delve in social and political aspects. We're talking about social cohesion and everything that the narrative political discourse means. To analyze all these matters, we have used four main techniques. First, documentary analysis. It is necessary to refer to this set of EU treaties and strategies, etc., that uh, revolve around the right to access justice. But we can't just stick to these international laws because there are certain barriers that people in vulnerable situations face. So beware, we have to be careful because some instruments regulate the right to access justice, but when people decide to access justice, find obstacles. And this is exactly what we try to address with our case studies. Identify those barriers, those obstacles, and based on that, try to structure the elements that can help us overcome the obstacles. So, uh, checking quantitative data was necessary. My project is still uh, being completed. We checked some elements like funds on social cohesion, Eurostat documents, and we also checked measuring and accountability instruments that the European Union has nowadays. And lastly, um, I carried out semi-structured interviews because there's something that I would like to highlight. We don't stick to what people from the academia tell us. Doctrine is important to have a legal debate, but we want to go beyond that. We want to also focus on the interviews that we will carry out, and we want to interview um, people from organizations that work with these vulnerable collectives, and we want to include vulnerable groups. Why not? And I'm referring to people with disability and people who are migrating. In this case, we used several methods. Critical discourse analysis to see how the European Union justifies through their social cohesion policies the situation, regulatory comparison to say, for example, here in my legal system, national legal system, access to justice is regulated in such a way. We have these practices, and maybe if we compare different legal systems, we can say whether a practice, for example, in Italy, can be implemented in a different legal order, or maybe with specific changes can be implemented in this or that state. We are talking about a right. We're talking about obstacles to accessing this right. So we have to check the impact assessment. Do cohesion policies have an impact in the fulfillment of these rights for people with vulnerabilities? I wish to shed light on this with my work. Now, this said, let us talk about the right in itself. What is the right to justice and what does it mean? We can talk about initial conceptions of right, primigenous conceptions of right, but I want to mention some structural elements. The right to access justice is a human right, and that is a human right because when we analyze the first international human rights instruments that I will refer later on, we identify that is this right is a human right. It is inherent, and it is connected to national constitutions. That is, most national constitutions recognize the right to access justice as a fundamental right. But we shouldn't just stay there. we have to go farther. Justice is a value. It's a inherent value in the European Union, and it is a value that is intrinsic to all constitutions. Most constitutions have in one of their first articles how this is developed. Um, it talks about the rule of law, the principles of equality, etc. So it's a structuring element in most social states, and it has to do with the rule of law. I would like to refer to justice and how it connects to the instrumental character of these elements. I would like to share an example. Let's imagine someone with disability whose right to education has been infringed and who wants to go to court. This person whose right has been violated needs to trigger the legal system, and the instrumental nature of the right to justice it comes into place because it makes it possible to trigger other rights. In connection with this, I want to propose something. Let's imagine this person with disability whose right to education has been violated and who wants to access the justice system. But when this person tries to do so, he or she realizes that um, they have to pay for the legal services of a lawyer, and that the legal system has costs that this person cannot afford.
So this is the first element, because when we talk about access to justice, we need to link it to certain guarantees. Um, I don't just need for you to recognize that I can have access to the justice systems. I also need certain guarantees that will enable me to actually exert that right. For example, if I am in a judicial process, someone would say to me, attending or according to the International Convention of the People with Disabilities, you have to adjust the procedure to my conditions. You need to give me certain supports and certain formalisms that do not satisfy my rights. So this is linked to the guarantees that should be subsequent or complementing the instrumental right. And in order to develop this guarantee, a positive mandate is therefore articulated for the public authorities to create the necessary conditions for this exercise. So, in constitutional recognition of the right is one step, but then the mandate needs to be satisfied too. I'm not just talking about the lawmaking process. This has to be seen from a broader perspective. I'm talking about the mere existence of courts of justice or magistrates, judges that can decide on the conflict once I get access to them, the deadlines to be met for the resolution of certain conflicts. So I said that this is a human right, a fundamental one that is enshrined in international instruments, the foundational instruments, such as the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 8, which states that everyone has the right to an effective remedy. And similarly, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966 in Article 2.3 that recognizes the right to a remedy in Article 14 that proclaims that everyone should be entitled to a fair and public hearing. For a person to be able to accept the rights, a certain number of minimum guarantees should guarantee that. And then we can refer to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is linked to the instrumental character. It doesn't expressly refer to the right of access to justice, but in Article 2.1 refers to taking all measures to guarantee the ESCR. And so that every person can satisfy their ambitions in the judiciary. In the international arena, we also find other instruments. For example, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women from 1979, the Convention on the Rights of the Child of 1989, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is the main instrument that I have used because of the subject matter I am covering. At the European level, we have two framework instruments. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights, 1950, that doesn't regulate the right to justice, but only implicitly through the right to an equitative process, and also Article 13 that refers to the right to an effective remedy. So this reference is also included in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, Article 47, which enshrines the right of every person to effective judicial protection before an impartial tribunal with guarantees and, when necessary, the guarantees that you need when a lawsuit is filed. This is also guaranteed by the European Court of Justice. And I just will refer to a fundamental question here. Currently, we talk about the theory of the evolution of human rights, the positive consecration that bets on the inclusion but goes back to the origins. And that's why both courts in matters of disability have recognized that people in situation of vulnerability, such as people with disabilities, for example, in English in 2006 and in the case of Hungary in 2006 too, showed that when they make the rulings, these courts have to take into account the Convention on the rights of people with disabilities, because they need to take both into account in order to adopt their approaches for certain rights, such as accessibility, the right to access to the justice, if they require supporting measures. People don't always require supports, but if they are required, the courts need to refer to those instruments because they are enshrined in our body of legislation. So I've provided you with some references to what justice is, and now I want to talk about some ideas of certain groups and the barriers they face when getting access to justice. My idea, and I know it's not shared by everyone, I am talking about the rules of Brasilia, the rights of people in situations of vulnerability. Since groups and people with vulnerabilities will not always be the same in all regions and latitudes, I like to talk about causes or conditions of vulnerability. And for example, these causes are age, and then we have minors, children, teenagers, and the elderly, old people. And another cause is gender and the associated consequences for women, or, for example, migrants. So, migration is for migrants or asylum seekers. Another condition would be deprivation of liberty, and the people deprived of liberty. So, more than giving you a definition of the people or the groups, I like to talk about causes of vulnerability. But these vulnerability conditions will influence on the group or the persons we're talking about. And those people will face barriers when trying to access justice. I'm giving you the barriers I have identified so far. For example, economic barriers, poverty, which is cause for vulnerability. If you look at it from an intersectional perspective, it intertwines with other types of causes. For example, a person can be at the same time poor, a migrant, black, a woman, and have a disability. In all these causes can be in one person. And so there is a barrier for every condition so that they have a reinforced vulnerability condition. For example, judicial costs of assistance will limit the effectiveness of the right to get access to the justice. But there are many other barriers. For example, look at the procedural barriers. When a person in a situation of vulnerability, for example, a person with disability, um, gets access to the judiciary, if a magistrate has tools at their disposal to give them support, sometimes they don't use them. For example, to expedite the process, if it's solved within 1 year, maybe it is too late because a person with disabilities may be dead in 1 year's time. So those procedural guarantees are necessary. There can be cultural barriers, for example, institutional rejection, mistrust in the judicial systems. Many people say, what's the point of trying to file a lawsuit if I know they won't take me into consideration, or they might be biased, or they may not guarantee me with the guarantees as written in the Constitution. And finally, I will refer to the digital barriers. We live in a world that is influenced by the ICTs, which means that some huge gaps have been created between the digital world and in the rural environments. So I've brought some indicators that I will skip or only talk about very quickly. These indicators come from the latest report, the 2024 report on the quality of access to the justice in Europe. For example, 85.4 euros is the average cost per person, but in the richest countries, 200 euros are spent per person. In recent years, there has been a reduction in the amount of money devoted to paying for the judiciary costs for the most vulnerable. There are also some gaps in people who can get effective access to justice. 30% of people living in the rural areas do not have access to uh, this justice. For example, another important fact number is the average time the lawsuit takes for its resolution. If it takes you 3 or 4 years to get a resolution, to get a solution, this is not useful. And then the alternative measures for dispute resolution. The European perspectives trend is to use them, but so far they have only been used in only 25% of the cases. Some of the data regarding the poverty level, which is also linked to the economic barriers. Since 2020, after the pandemic, there is some stability, but countries such as Bulgaria, Greece, and Romania have higher poverty indexes from 26 to 31% of the population. In Spain, according to the INE, 1 out of 4 people lives in poverty conditions. So logically, someone can say, if I have to pay for my costs, my services, I have priorities. Either I pay for the justice I need, or either I pay for my other priorities. And my reflection is, how can that be possible if it's a public mandate? What can the state do? What can the judiciary do to guarantee that if any person in a situation of economic vulnerability can get access to justice? There are some measures, but we have to review the thresholds. And now, I'd like to talk about some introductory notions on the social question. Now, talking about Europe, some people have already talked about them. I will just highlight 3 different points. When we talk about cohesion, are we talking about feeling of belonging, of unity, orientation towards the common good of a society? And that means, first of all, that there are social links, and then system of short values and rules, such as the justice system, and then you also have to feel that you belong to a notion of collective construction, and this is deeply linked to the right of access to justice. It is important in Europe, but what is done to foster that right, to make it a real right, to make it real effective? I will just skip some concepts. Social coherence in Europe is an operational, legal, and political category that tries to ascertain that all citizens can effectively participate on an equal footing. This is a category that finds foundation in the article of the in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, in one of the articles. Social cohesion is an objective because it allows you to develop the cohesion of all the policies. So we can reduce, or it tries to reduce, the territorial and social inequalities. It promotes equal opportunities, and it guarantees full participation of groups in situation of vulnerability. So here you can see the priorities of the Commission for 2024-2029. They refer to the strategic plan of the European Union for 2021-2027. One of the priorities was to promote and reinforce measures taken to protect our values, and so that groups in situations of vulnerability can really have the rights fulfilled and to get results that will enable us to talk in the future about the effectiveness of certain rights. So we need to find these enshrined in the norms. We need the regulations. We need to regulate. But in this case, we also need to take into account, or to take some measures that will enable us to satisfy those rights. And this is where we find the European funds as elements for the cohesion of the social, economic, and territorial policies. I will refer to just some of them and how I perceive them. First of all, the European Fund for Regional Development. Now we have 5 lines, or 5 priorities: a smarter Europe, a greener Europe, a more connected Europe, a Europe that is closer to the citizens, and a more social Europe. And the element that is closer to my research is a social Europe. Since 2023 and until 2024, December 2024, the latest reference, we see a considerable increase in the funds allocated to guarantee, for example, in the case of the integration to social actions for people in situation of social risk, so that people can get access to certain means, types of employment, types of information or training, are just some examples. But the fund that is deeply linked to this is the Plus European Fund 2021-2027. And you can find some examples that I put on the slide. For example, the FSE Plus Asturias, that is fighting for the social inclusion and against poverty. And for example, the FSE Plus Cantabria for homelessness, for for the homeless, and for people with certain disabilities. And I will skip this, and now I will give other examples, different examples. Another important example is the structural and European investment funds. Those 5 funds, those tycoon funds, that for 2020, 2014 and 2020 were linked to the defense of the fundamental rights and the respect of the International Convention of the Rights of the People with Disabilities. In 2006, because people started thinking, have we really made sure, have we taken the measures so that the rights materialize, so that they come true? And this is the example I will give. I'm talking about the Enable project that works on social inclusion in the right to justice of people with a mental disability. This project is composed of 9 countries and has improved knowledge on access to justice, training of the law operators, and to promote cooperation between operators and regions. So this is about Spain, Portugal, Spain, Lithuania, Bulgaria, the countries that take part in this cohesion policy, territorial cohesion policy. And the last aspect, the challenges of this policy. We need to talk about the challenges before the digital justice, because we are living in an era of digitization, and this is cross-sectionally influencing the justice administration. So the challenge lies in how to guarantee the accessibility of that justice without creating a new cause of exclusion of those who seek justice. So here you can find some tools. There are many of them, but some are really important. For instance, one is the Codex. It's a tool for safe communication, secure communication, that reduces some deadlines. For example, if there is a cross-border lawsuit, a cross-border conflict, 2 different countries can communicate using this tool on a specific case. And then EDIS, the last one, it's for evidence taking. If I need to record witness, and the witness is in Italy, and I need, of course, to interview that person with certain guarantees, then I can use this tool, and the person can witness in Italy, and I can use it in Spain. And then the last one is my e-Justicia, which is like a unified entry into the European context. It's like, you know what the digital certificate is, right? Because I use my electronic certificate that I can use for many different applications and processes and actions. So the electronic certificate is not enough for, I don't know, a lawsuit, But in My e-Justice, you can find many different judiciary electronic records or certificates that you can use thanks to this tool. So, more examples, or what can we propose if we are to boost this right? We have to make good use of the European funds. The EDRF is not really related to access to justice, but it can benefit those who seek justice, for example, by offering feasible structures, courts, offices, the borders. They can provide with advice or consultancy from certain professionals. Other funds can provide you with training, for example, for people who don't know about their rights, how can they protect or defend their rights, or training in terms of accessibility, digital accessibility. And the Cohesion Fund is, for example, for people living in rural areas, in areas of low population density who do not have access to many forms of justice. And how can we do this? Well, by organizing platforms, digital platforms, inclusive digital platforms, or, for example, one-stop shops for consultancy and advice. Sometimes we spend money on climate, for example. Why not use specific funds for this right of accessibility, access to justice for people with vulnerability? And that's why we need to talk about multi-level governance. It is not just the funds. The funds need to be coordinated between municipalities, states, member states, so that this action, this strategy, this priority that has really proven to be effective is funded. Or if a certain model needs to be changed, we can also create transparent justice tables. We need to understand about institutions that have a real incidence in the protection of these people and groups with disabilities. For example, in Spain, the CERMI, or the agencies that protect people with mental disabilities that need to be reinforced. And now some final conclusions. Of course, this is a construction process, as we've said, but Europe, in my view, cannot be built upon persistent inequalities. There are groups at risk, or groups in a situation of vulnerability, and some limitations in their access to justice. So justice must be understood as an effective access to everyone's rights, which is the basis of the democratic question. This is not just a technical issue. This is a question of legitimacy, use, inclusion, common future. And let me finish by saying what I said 40 minutes ago. Without an effective access to justice, there is no possible social cohesion or real democracy. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Wilbemis, for your presentation. It's an original topic. This talking about the link between access to justice and social cohesion is very interesting. And I think it opens up new avenues of thought. You've covered many different topics. I also found it interesting that you wanted to combine methodological tools as because in the legal field we don't always do that. So with the use of quantitative data and interviews is interesting. It's valuable, even if this is something you still need to do, right? Yes, I've done some of the interviews. I've chosen the easiest part so far, the academic part, because this is just a branch within my thesis. So I've already conducted some interviews with members of the academia and some organizations such as the CERMI. Thank you, and thank you for the clarification. And I also like the multi-level dimension. We are talking about fundamental rights, and that seems obvious, right? It seems obvious that we have to adopt a multi-level approach.
I also found it very interesting the access of digitalization as a vulnerability factor. This is something that could be expanded because, on the one hand, digitalization seeks to facilitate access to justice, but it also excludes other groups. So there's an ambivalence here, and it should be worked on. You cover lots of ground, so maybe we shouldn't take into consideration all the comments that we make, but well, we're gonna make them anyways. When we talk about access to justice of vulnerable groups, it would be interesting to talk about the access of NGOs and civil society and how this access to justice takes place. Because these groups make it possible to catalyze or to implement the access to justice of vulnerable groups that may not have this access. Maybe something that you would like to address. I know that it's a new element, but when we talk about social cohesion, this brings us to the topic of environmental justice. Vulnerable groups often suffer the effects of environmental damage in a disproportionate way and often live in environmentally damaged areas or areas that are subject to these damages. You talk about funds and projects that are funded. These groups may be affected by the implementation of certain projects funded under this framework. This is something that could be explored. The access to justice in connection to environmental justice, always in connection with your topic. I don't want to open a whole new avenue. We should focus on vulnerable groups and how these connect to social cohesion policy. You refer to the definition of social cohesion in the European Union and so on and so forth. And I think when it comes to the legal framework, you could also refer to the principle of solidarity that it's enshrined in the treaties. This may help you to establish these connections. You referred to case studies to identify barriers, but I didn't see them reflected in the presentation as such. In your work, you explain this in further detail, but I haven't seen that. properly. I would also like to see how this impacts on the vulnerable groups that you identified. I could make many more comments, but let us not mention everything so that we can have more space for debate. Thank you very much for your presentation and congratulations. Well, thank you for your reflections. This topic paves the way for many different other themes. I focused on the accessibility of vulnerable groups, and I focused on two specific ones, although I mentioned all of them. So I talk about people with disability and migrants. Obviously, there are different organizations. Indeed, I couldn't talk about all of this for time reasons. I analyzed questions that have to do with the legitimization of certain organizations and the legitimacy that these organizations have to access the Court of Justice of the European Union. You don't have ordinary legitimacy, but you have extraordinary legitimacy to access because you are representing the interests of a group or a person or a specific case or collective actions of people who couldn't defend themselves individually. There was recently ruling by the Court of Justice. It was a person with disability who had passed away, but this organization had decided to continue with this case because it was understood that this person's rights had been violated. And although there was no point in it was ineffective whatever would come out of that sentence, but it was going to be useful for others. It was very representative. If I try to connect this to the right of justice, it would open up many other avenues. When it comes to climate justice, of course, and this affects all of us. We're all part of the environment. We're all affected directly, and particularly people in situations of vulnerability are more affected. People who live in unhealthy situations, that can be people with that additionally have disabilities, maybe migrants. This is an approach that could be developed, but that would be expanding the field. And I think my project in itself is already ambitious and it requires more time to be developed. But I take note of all your comments. I think they are all very pertinent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and let's continue with the Q&A session.
Okay, so you got questions. Thank you, Wilbemis, for this presentation. I really appreciated your delivery, and it was very, very nicely delivered, and the slides were very explanatory. Rodrigo's presentation and your presentation, they share the same, let's say, analytic approach. How and why. Similarly, as I said to Rodrigo, you are both focused on macro levels. Macro levels that explain processes, that map stakeholders. And I have very high hopes for your chapter because it's very well researched, but I still think that you need to be more careful in how you label things such as effectiveness and also assessment, impact assessment, because I don't think you're actually still there. So what I mean by this is that you have very well situated the hypothesis at the beginning of your paper, your presentation. It is very clear what you're trying to say, that the existence of barriers inhibits social cohesion, and then you say, I focus on vulnerable groups, and vulnerable groups actually, and what you call as inclusivity, of these vulnerable groups, this is actually your main indicator, okay, for the macro level analysis. But there is this, let's say, theoretical problem with impact evaluation that you're trying to assess, because it's not clear actually that this is an impact assessment, because impact assessment is something else. You mentioned efficiency, but in order to measure the efficiency, you have to have very well-developed indicators. But then you present the indicators, but indicators are not your indicators. They are indicators of the European Commission. So this ties with what Bettina said, because this is a macro level analysis. So this is all very, very useful, and it's also very, very true and very helpful and informative for your analysis. But if you scale down your research, then you can effectively do the impact analysis of the processes that has to focus on certain type of category, vulnerable category, certain type of mechanism. Then you have to test whether this approach that the European Union has is actually promoting this inclusivity and using mechanisms that are able to support effectiveness. So put in simple terms, in very simple. So when you speak about best practices, these are not best practices. These are mechanisms. These are mechanisms that the European Commission, European Union uses to support the objective of more inclusivity. Best practices would mean that you have to have some kind of evidence of whether the process is effective, okay? And then best practice is a comparison to an ideal. So what is ideal? Like, this is best practice is very, very tricky. So think about that. But I want to ask you about, one big question. So this is, everything is like super connected to what you should probably read more about, which is the theory of change. The theory of change for you and Rodrigo, it's quite important because it would help you to explain the processes, outcomes, the stakeholders, the mapping of the needs, the delivery of results, and then help you test the effectiveness of these processes. But what I want to tell you is, how do you, in broader terms, in terms of results of what you're trying to show and also what you're trying to recommend at the end of your presentation, what this tells you about the quality of justice, your initial hypothesis, okay? So if we eliminate or diminish, eliminate these barriers to access to justice, okay? If this produces more European values, more cohesion, what this tells us about the quality of justice, this analysis that you produced so far? Because quality is differently from effectiveness, yeah?
Pues nada, en primer lugar, pues agradecerle por...
Well, thank you so much. First, thank you for your assessment. And thanks for your recommendations and your questions. I took the freedom of started working on this, and I realized that there are barriers. There are groups in a situation of vulnerability, but there's a right that needs to be guaranteed. That is a fundamental human right. Clearly, when we talk about indicators and how we can really guarantee that there is a limitation to access justice, we have to refer to barriers. Barriers, for example, the economic barrier. So what indicators can tell me that the barriers have been eliminated or, on the contrary, they remain? First, I was talking about the poverty rate in a specific context. First, I was talking about the European Union, and then about Spain. If 1 in 4 people live under the poverty threshold, and this person may have to see whether to cover their basic needs or start a legal case, obviously, the person is going to choose to have their basic needs covered. That's the previous and the first idea. Then when it comes to assessing whether mechanisms or good practices or what indicators can be used for limiting those barriers, I have to take a look at the number of cases where people in a specific vulnerability situation have accessed. For example, X number of people access justice in this period, right? These people have these specific rights satisfied. And then I analyze interviews. You participated in a specific matter. What was your experience? How would you assess the barriers that you encountered to access this case? Did you encounter any limitations in terms of free legal guidance? Did you have to pay for the costs? And of course, this has to do with cohesion and funds. I agree. We could refer to these as mechanisms that the European Union has, like, for example, the cohesion policy. For example, we have the cohesion European fund, and through this fund, I can earmark 5 million to guarantee the training of legal justice officers or the access of people in situations of risk. And here I can say, for example, in the case of the NAVLE project, a certain budget of 3 million is allocated to provide the access to that someone with disabilities does not find any limits. I can see that here we have a mechanism, we have a fund, and there's a specific policy that is a project that is limited. There's a field of action, there are variables, and then I see that in the
But these are different levels of analysis. So this wasn't clear in your presentation that for the case study, you intend to do with the micro level of analysis where you test the quality and access to justice. So, but also the perception of justice, especially for vulnerable categories, where you rightfully say they have these intersectional vulnerabilities. They can be women, they can have, it's quite subjective, the perception of justice. But what you're saying about the effectiveness is something else. When you speak about the micro level, you're talking about the effects. You're not talking about effectiveness. And what you also said, it's quite interesting in terms of indicators just now in the response, because it really goes to show that really you need to read about theory of change to understand, to capture the effects of something, to measure the efficiency. You have to have the baseline data, and then you have the intervention of the European Union, and then you capture the result at the end line. So this distance between the baseline and the end line is exactly what I'm talking about, the effectiveness. So if you don't have the data where you started, how can you measure the change? How can you capture the change? You cannot even capture the quality of change. That is better if you focus more on micro level analysis or meso level of analysis before inferring about bigger mechanisms on micro level. But one informs the other. And fundamentally what you're aiming at is transformative justice, not delivery of justice. Yeah?
Pues sí, muchas gracias, lo tendré en cuenta. Por suerte tenemos 4, 5, 6 meses para...
Luckily, I have 4 or 5 months to think of all these things, but I really appreciate your analysis. Good morning. My name is Miguel Fornaris from the University Rey Juan Carlos, sorry, and the University of Bologna. I wanted to ask you something. What groups are you exactly limiting the subject of your study? You have talked about migrant people and people with disabilities. The needs of each group are different. When you talk about migrants, are you talking about, for example, if they can access international protection process, which is something very specific, or once they're in a regular situation in Spain, what would be the problem to access language, economy, and then when it comes to people with disabilities, I don't know if you have considered breaking the groups, because like, for example, mental disabilities are not the same as physical disabilities. When it comes to disabilities, there is something else that is connected, and that is health circumstances. For example, there may be people who suffer discrimination because they are HIV positive, for instance, but that's not part of the scope of disabilities. So I would like to know exactly how you will address this. On the other hand, I would like to ask a question about the access to justice. What problems have you detected? For example, we have the legal counseling law. If you have a disability, you are automatically included in this program, and specific health circumstances can be considered too. When it comes to Europe, I wanted to ask you something. We have talked a lot about cooperation on a European level. The judicial instruments are really complex. For a regular lawyer, this is really complicated. For regular people, I imagine this would be super hard. I don't know if that's what you wanted to mention, or you were focusing on legal jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction. Since 1993, the Ministry of Justice has launched a campaign through different regulations for the technological access through forms. For example, there's a specific form for air transportation. So I would like to see how you are limiting the subject of your research. I want to say something. In the University of Alcalá, we have a legal clinic. It's one of the best in Spain. It's spectacular. They're addressing HIV cases. They work with the Ministry of Health, and they are doing everything. They are limiting their work to working with this specific group of people. I will start from the back. Thanks so much for mentioning the University of Alcalá and this clinic. I'm really proud to be part of the University of Alcalá. Yes, we include different conditions, for example, HIV, but when it comes to health insurance, in the cases that I dealt with, have to do, for example, if we have a migrant person who wants to settle in Spain, this person finds limitations when it comes to accessing drugs. So how can we guarantee this access? What are the mechanisms and the avenues to guarantee this access to health? When, for example, if I get a visa, I need to have health insurance. But if I say I am HIV positive, I won't get this coverage. This is one idea. Other ideas have to do with, for example, people who have certain health condition and they decide to get a mortgage, for example. That clinic that you're referring to does a wonderful work. A wonderful, it's doing something wonderful. Then, about groups, we address the groups in general. And then it is true that one of the aspects that I focus more on is people with disability. As you very rightly said, people with disability is a really broad group. I will try to focus more specifically on conditions that have to do with mental health. That is why we are going to refer to, among other things, it's not only about judicial facilitators or, for example, reducing or simplifying procedures. And there are procedures that go beyond the law. You were talking about Law 1 of 1996 with the two amendments and the legal guidance or counseling in Spain. And this establishes a set of instructions or articles that mean that people can access free legal counseling when there are certain circumstances. For example, we're not just talking about people with disabilities, it also includes victims of violence, terrorists, human trafficking, among others. Something very important that is framed in this topic and that I will address in my thesis is the access to justice of people with highly stigmatized health conditions. For example, who determines that someone with highly stigmatized health condition, for example, an HIV positive person, or some other social conditions. We're talking about social conditions. So how can this person access the right to free legal counseling? And then we have the levels and rates. We're talking about merely economic indicators. Who says that having an income of 13,400 is that different from 13,401 euro? I mean, there are limits that are established and in terms of the income. If I get it right, you were referring to cooperation. This is very complex. I know it may sound ideal, but we have to rethink digitalization. Digitalization is there. We're talking about cohesion, we're talking about territorial cohesion and cross-border transnational cohesion. So we have to be capable of implementing those mechanisms using funds. For example, if there are funds to create infrastructures, if there are funds to develop tools or instruments that cannot be implemented in certain regions because it is very costly. I didn't have time to explain my presentation in further detail, but if we have funds, how can we guarantee digital accessibility with these funds? Let's be careful. There's a political, territorial, and economic cohesion policy. Let's use it. As you said, it's not easy. Relations between states are complex by themselves. So how can we aspire to having a relationship like this from a judicial perspective, and much more complicated when we talk about cross-border cases, and when we have to deal with who has the jurisdiction, who's competent to do things. It's really broad. Thank you for your question, because we have to carry out a very detailed analysis of all these questions. But this serves as an incentive. There is a real problem. Digitalization is here. We intend to have a cooperation, but we're not cooperating. So how do we go about this? Thank you very much. You made a great effort, and this is very valuable. You tried to systematize a problem, the problem of vulnerable groups. Working on vulnerable groups means to work on a very ambiguous category, because we don't really know, as you said, what vulnerable groups are. And I'm not just talking about the European context. I talk about outside the European Union too. If you try to project a research work and focus on vulnerable groups, you want to provide this image, the legal framework can be useful, but you are not saying anything about vulnerable groups. Access to justice from vulnerable groups has to be worked based on case studies. You have to base your work from a micro level. What Professor Milosevic said was absolutely right, and I think we would all agree on that. I think doctorate students sometimes have an approach that is their own approach, and you base your work on your perspective, but you realize that when you share your perspective with other people, with other doctorate students, and with experts that work from different perspectives, you may realize that you need to restate your approach. And that's what we're trying to tell you with these questions and answers. I think the impact that you want to see, if you want to have better justice for vulnerable groups, you have to base your work in the context, because as you very well said, vulnerable groups are not a category. It's not a legal category, and it's not a category in any way except for the cases that that you can see in practice.
Yes, you can talk about people with disabilities, and that would be a category. But there are many vulnerable groups, many different women, many different types of women with different specificities. So conceptualizing this topic is very complicated. And then even more complicated it is to elevate it to a law category. For example, speaking about the digital certificate, how many of you have got it? Why? Because you work in the academia and you need to have a digital signature. Would you have it otherwise? There you go. If you don't need a digital signature, you don't need access to a digital certificate. It's an utopia, and I totally agree with it. The population will become more and more digital, but that is an utopia for the time being. Because some people don't even understand what a digital certificate is, even the two words separately, digital and certificate. So when it comes to processing some information and some knowledge with a social impact, you need to understand the social impact with the cases, the different cases, the different case examples. I'm not saying you don't need to generate like that background information. I am just saying that you should focus your research on the case by case basis and not in the rules. Thank you. Thank you for the question. When we decided on this research with my tutors, they asked me what I wanted to understand, how the vulnerable groups are treated and how they get access to justice. And that's why I've done the analysis the opposite way. What vulnerabilities find the groups, the vulnerable groups in when they try to get access to the justice system? And yes, I understand and I totally agree that I should use more case studies. But I have worked with many rulings, not just at a supranational level with the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights or the European Court of Justice, also local courts. When it comes to the breaching, the violation of certain rights, I've also read the rulings of by the Supreme Court. If that is the idea, I think I said it. How can I identify the barrier when I see that on a recurrent basis, certain people with disabilities face limitations in getting access to the justice system? And I found them in the case studies. There's no discussion there. Maybe I said it in a too simple way because the moderator said, yeah, you mentioned the cards, but you didn't put examples in the PowerPoint. But I talked about the Hungary case. That was one of the paradigms. And yes, I need to go to the basis. The basis means identifying people with disability that encounter barriers when it comes to accessing the justice. But this is a work in progress. I have only been working on this for a month and a half. This could be the topic of a full PhD thesis. So this is just an approximation. If I want to do a real decent work, then I have to take into account everything you have contributed with. So thank you. Thank you, Will. Armando Santana from the Jaén University. Thank you for your presentation. I was just curious, so I have some questions and a remark. I liked it when you refer to the categorization of the groups based on the cause for the vulnerability, according to the rules of Brasilia that you mentioned. So my first question, and I'm just curious, I don't know if in your study you will limit yourself to certain countries. If so, do those countries match the enable countries? Would you be using the enable countries? And then I have a couple remarks. if you find them useful. The Pro Bono Foundation in Spain has published some reports that you might find useful. Maybe you know them already. And then there is another author, I don't remember the name, I think it's like Brandon Morrison, something like that. He wrote a paper in the New Growth Journal that is along the same lines. I'll try to find it. Thank you. I read it. Don't look for it. I've already read it. But thank you. Yes, so originally, I have to insist, this is a complex project. That's why I was talking about the Brasilia Rose, which is a broad spectrum Ibero-American project focusing on access to justice. And I said, okay, all this access is different per se because we're not vulnerable everywhere. For example, HIV. HIV in some developed countries can be a minor problem, but think about the stigma. Think about the attitudes. In South Africa, 22% of the population lives with HIV. So the perception of a group with vulnerability changes from country to country. And about the countries, yeah, well, the first country will be Spain, and then Cuba, because I come from Cuba, and I can find some case studies there. And in contrast, since I like the analysis of the economic vulnerability, I thought about Greece because of the relevance it had in the whole European project. I wanted to study the limitations in access to justice. Thank you. And thank you for the reference. Also, as Parifica Petelli's papers. Thank you. Very briefly, we don't have the time for more, but thank you for your talk. I have one macro and one micro remarks. Access to justice is a perfect indicator when it comes to the reports of the efficacy of the rule of law and the link between those two. It is one of the indicators of justice of the European Commission and the verification criteria of the Venice Convention. Very detailed. So they can be a good support for many of the things you've mentioned. And then more specifically speaking for Spain. In Spain, the administration of the justice administration lies in the autonomous regions. That and the digitization process is a nightmare because there is no connectivity among the different systems each community uses. So when it comes to cooperation, the necessary cooperation even within the territory, I'm not talking about cooperation with the rest of Europe. Domestic cooperation is being a nightmare. So maybe you should mention it to see if that is like a wake-up call. Because the most important thing is the person seeking justice, the person who needs to have the rights guaranteed, the justiciable. Yes, the last report in 2024 by the Commission, I used them for the data I gave to you, the 85.4 euros, the 200 euros, all those economic data. And regarding the second question, yes, of course. Yeah, there is a discrepancy in the access. My name is Desejava Dimitrova from Malaga University. Congratulations, Will, because it was very beautiful and a very solid topic. I just wanted to ask you something because if, well, you focus on justice, but I'd like to know whether you have considered, for example, the requirement for people to ask for uh, to ask for a specific moment and date and time when they want to talk to the administration or to get access to the justice system. So yes, I've considered that because we will talk about it later because you made me think about it. It's extremely important. Thank you, Will. Thank you for your exhibition. Bettina, anything else to say? I just want to thank you for doing this work. I just wanted to make a final remark. When we talk, well, when for this paper to be published, when you revisit, if you want to revise the results, please highlight the pan-European dimension. We're talking about a micro level. This groups access to justice. You will be talking about the funds and the mechanisms that can be used to improve that access. And then the results. Of course, first from the perspective of the groups, and then from a European perspective, from a pan-European perspective, to see whether that cohesion purpose is being met. That's all. Thank you. It was